Deep within the gilded halls of the imperial palace, clad in armour of burnished gold, stands a figure whose legacy casts a shadow across 10,000 years of human history. Constantin Valdor, the first of the 10,000, the Emperor's Spear, the Captain General who stood eye to eye with demigods and never blinked. His name is whispered in reverence by those who guard the Golden Throne, recorded in histories that span volumes, immortalised in the annals of the Imperium as perhaps the single most loyal being who ever drew breath in service to the master of mankind. But here's the question that gnaws at the mind of every scholar, every historian, every soul who's delved into the twisted chronicles of the Imperium. Why him? What made Constantin Valdor special? What qualities did he possess that elevated him above all others? Why, out of all the genetically perfected warriors the Emperor could have chosen, out of all the custodians who walked the halls of Terra during those blood-soaked days of unification, did the master of mankind select this particular golden sentinel to lead his personal guard? The answer to that question reveals more about the Emperor's grand design than perhaps anything else in the grim darkness of the far future. It illuminates the priorities that drove the creation of the Imperium, the qualities the Emperor valued above raw power or tactical genius, the characteristics that would prove essential not just for conquering the galaxy, but for preserving humanity's future across millennia of unceasing war. The story of Constantin Valdor is not simply the tale of one warrior, no matter how exceptional. It's a window into the Emperor's methodology, his priorities, and the very foundation upon which the Imperium was built. To understand why Valdor was chosen is to understand what the Emperor truly valued when the fate of humanity hung in the balance. Before we enter the 41st millennium, a simple request. Subscribe to Obsidian Scriptorium. For you, it's a simple tap. For me, it's proof of loyalty that keeps the Inquisition from auditing my existence. The Emperor protects those with good metrics. Now, let the story begin. Let's begin with what we know for certain. Constantin Valdor was not merely the first Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. He was, by many accounts, the very first Custodian. Though Valdor himself did not recall whether he was truly the first or simply the first successfully produced, the records that survive suggest he predated even the Thunder Warriors who would later conquer Terra. His existence stretches back to the earliest days of the Emperor's emergence from the shadows, back when Terra was still a fractured wasteland of warring techno-barbarian kingdoms. The mystery surrounding Valdor's origins is itself telling. According to fragments recovered from ancient texts, particularly the accounts of Amar Astarte, the Emperor moved entire armies across continents to locate and retrieve the child who would become Constantin Valdor. His original parents were killed, though whether by the Emperor's hand or in the chaos of old Earth is unclear. What is certain is that from his earliest days, Valdor's past was erased, his memories of mortal life stripped away as part of the transformation that would make him into something far greater than human. But the Emperor didn't simply stumble upon Valdor by chance. The master of mankind, with his vast psychic powers and ability to peer through the currents of time, would have seen something in that child, something that made him commit resources, move armies, and ensure that this particular soul would become the foundation upon which his grand design would be built. To understand what that something was, we need to examine the world Valdor was born into, and what the Emperor required to survive it. Terra in the dying days of the 29th millennium was a nightmare made flesh. For thousands of years, the age of strife had torn humanity's birth world apart. What had once been the jewel of a galaxy-spanning civilization had devolved into a patchwork of warring kingdoms, each ruled by techno-barbarian warlords who wielded weapons left over from the dark age of technology. These were not primitive savages with clubs and spears. These were tyrants who commanded armies equipped with Volkite weaponry, conversion beamers, and technologies that could reduce mountains to ash. The Maul and Sen Confederacy practiced dark rituals and human sacrifice on an industrial scale. The Ethnarchy commanded genetically modified warriors called the Urcasis and enslaved psykers by the thousands. The Empire of Ursh, ruled by the infamous warlord Callaghan, had forged an empire of such cruelty that its very name became synonymous with horror. These were the forces the Emperor would have to overcome to unite Terra, and conventional armies would not be enough. The Emperor had spent millennia preparing for this moment. Hidden in the depths beneath what would become the Imperial Palace, he had constructed laboratories where the accumulated genetic lore of thousands of years could be put to use. He had studied the human genome with an obsession that bordered on madness, seeking to understand every chemical pathway, every genetic sequence, every method by which the human form could be enhanced beyond its natural limits. His first great work was the Thunder Warriors. These were the proto-Astartes, genetically enhanced warriors of incredible power, created from adult male volunteers. Each Thunder Warrior stood head and shoulders above a normal man, possessed of strength that could tear armoured vehicles apart, and resilience that allowed them to shrug off wounds that would kill a dozen normal soldiers. They were savage, unstoppable, the perfect weapons for the blood-soaked wars of unification. But they were flawed. The genetic modifications that created the Thunder Warriors were crude, forceful, imposed upon adult bodies that resisted the changes even as they were transformed. The Thunder Warriors' enhanced physiology often rebelled against itself, causing them to deteriorate rapidly, to succumb to madness and violence as their bodies broke down. They were powerful, yes, but they were not sustainable. They were weapons with a short shelf life, tools the Emperor could use to conquer Terra, but not to build a lasting imperium. The Emperor knew this from the beginning. He had always known the Thunder Warriors were temporary, that they would need to be replaced by something better, something more refined. And so, even as the Thunder Warriors waged their brutal campaigns across Terra, the Emperor was already working on their replacements. 2 replacements, actually, each designed for a different purpose. The Legiones Astartes would be his mass-produced warriors, created through the implantation of gene seed and additional organs into adolescent humans. They would be organised into legions led by genetically crafted generals known as Primarchs, and they would conquer the galaxy in his name. But before the Space Marines, before the Primarchs, there were the Custodians. The Custodian Guard represented everything the Emperor had learned from creating the Thunder Warriors, refined to an art form that bordered on the divine. Where the Thunder Warriors were created quickly from adult volunteers using techniques that were brilliant but fundamentally flawed, the Custodians were taken as infants from the noble houses of Terra, their transformation beginning before their minds could form memories that might conflict with their purpose. Where the Thunder Warriors received crude genetic enhancements that were forced upon their bodies like armour bolted onto flesh that rejected it, the Custodians underwent a process so subtle, so profound, that it occurred at the cellular level, rewriting their very being from the ground up. The difference between creating a Thunder Warrior and creating a Custodian is the difference between forging a blade and growing a perfect crystal. The Thunder Warrior process was forceful, immediate, powerful, but unstable. Adult men were taken, and their bodies were transformed through genetic manipulation that rewrote their physiology in weeks or months. The results were spectacular in the short term. These warriors could tear through enemy formations like demigods, could shrug off wounds that would kill normal men, could inspire fear in the hearts of their enemies through sheer physical presence alone. But the human body, especially an adult human body, resists such dramatic changes. The genetic code that defines what we are is not meant to be rewritten so drastically, so quickly. The Thunder Warriors' enhanced physiology was constantly at war with their original biology, like 2 opposing forces locked in eternal struggle within the same flesh. Over time, this internal conflict would inevitably lead to breakdown. Some Thunder Warriors lasted decades, others deteriorated in just a few years. All of them knew on some level that their bodies were living on borrowed time, breaking down from the inside even as they conquered Terra in the Emperor's name. The Emperor understood this limitation from the beginning. He knew the Thunder Warriors were a temporary solution, powerful enough to win the Unification Wars, but too unstable to serve as the foundation for a lasting imperium. And so, even as the Thunder Warriors bled and died to unite Terra, the Emperor was perfecting something better. Something that would last not just years or decades, but centuries. Something that could be sustained, replicated, improved upon. Something that would become the template for all future genetic enhancement in the Imperium. The Custodians were that something. Each Custodian was a unique work of art, individually crafted by the Emperor himself or by the most accomplished bioalchemists working under his direct supervision in hidden laboratories deep beneath what would become the Imperial Palace. No two Custodians were exactly alike. Each was tailored to their particular genetic potential, their enhancements customized to bring out the absolute best of what that individual could become. Where Space Marines would later be mass-produced using standardized gene seed and following rigid protocols, each Custodian received a bespoke transformation, their genetic enhancement calibrated to their specific physiology, with a precision that makes modern genetic engineering look like cave paintings compared to Renaissance art. The process was extraordinarily difficult, far more complex than the later creation of Space Marines. The failure rate was catastrophic. Many candidates died during the transformation, their bodies unable to withstand the profound changes being wrought at the cellular level. Others went mad as their minds tried to process the enhancement of their cognitive abilities, their consciousness expanding too rapidly for their psyches to handle. Still others survived physically but emerged broken psychologically, unable to function as the perfect warriors the Emperor required. But those who survived, those rare individuals whose genetic code proved capable of accepting the transformation, and whose minds proved resilient enough to withstand the psychological conditioning, became something extraordinary. They became Custodians, and they were unlike any other warriors humanity had ever produced or ever would produce again. The Custodians stood taller than Space Marines would later stand, their enhanced frames carrying muscle density that seemed impossible, that should have made them slow and cumbersome, but instead moved with a grace that seemed to defy physics itself. They moved like flowing water made solid, like golden light given form. Watching a Custodian in combat was like watching a master swordsman practice kata, except that each movement was lethal, each gesture calculated to maximum efficiency, each strike placed with a precision that made it seem inevitable rather than chosen. Their physical capabilities were extraordinary. A Custodian could run for days without tiring, could go weeks without sleep if necessary, could heal from wounds that would cripple a normal human in hours rather than weeks. Their bones were denser than ceramite, their muscle fibers woven with metallic threads that multiplied their strength while maintaining flexibility. Their nervous systems had been enhanced to process information at speeds measured in microseconds, allowing them to react to threats before those threats fully manifested. But perhaps most impressively, their minds had been sharpened to an edge that could cut through the fog of war itself. A Custodian could process tactical information from multiple sources simultaneously, could run thousands of combat simulations in the seconds before engaging an enemy, could predict enemy movements based on the slightest changes in stance or weapon position. They were not simply warriors who fought well, they were weapons that thought, that analysed, that adapted to any threat with an intelligence that matched their physical prowess. The Custodians stood taller than Space Marines, moved with a grace that seemed impossible for beings of their size, and possessed mental faculties that allowed them to think and react with superhuman speed. They were not simply stronger and faster than normal humans. They were rebuilt from the foundations up, every system in their bodies optimized to perfection. Their muscle fibers were denser, their bones harder, their nervous systems faster. Their minds were sharpened to razor keenness, capable of processing information and making tactical decisions in the span of a heartbeat. But perhaps most importantly, The Custodians were psychologically conditioned in ways the Thunder Warriors never were, in ways that would make even the later Space Marines seem emotionally uncontrolled by comparison. Their loyalty to the Emperor was absolute, woven into the very fabric of their being through processes that some scholars have described as mental castration, though that term doesn't capture the full scope of what was done to these warriors' psyches. The psychological conditioning of a Custodian begins during the transformation process itself. As the child's body is rebuilt at the cellular level, their mind is simultaneously reshaped, reformed, focused into a burning point of purpose that will define their entire existence. This is not brainwashing in any conventional sense. It is not the implantation of false beliefs or the suppression of natural instincts through fear or punishment. It is something far more profound, far more complete. The conditioning rewrites the fundamental architecture of how a Custodian thinks, how they process information, how they assign value and meaning to their experiences. From the moment their transformation is complete, a Custodian does not see the world the way normal humans see it. They do not form attachments the way humans form attachments. They do not feel loyalty as a choice or duty as a burden. These concepts are integrated into their consciousness at such a fundamental level that questioning them would be like a human questioning whether they should continue breathing. This creates beings who are, in some ways, less than human, and in other ways, far more. Less because they lack the capacity for many of the emotions and connections that define the human experience. They have no brothers, no sense of kinship with each other beyond the mission they serve. When a Custodian stands next to another Custodian, they do not feel the warmth of comradeship that Space Marines feel for their battle brothers. They simply recognize another tool serving the same function, another weapon pointed in the same direction. But they are more than human in their absolute focus, their perfect dedication, their inability to be swayed by sentiment or distracted by personal desire. A human soldier might hesitate before killing a former comrade who has turned traitor, might be paralyzed by conflicting loyalties or memories of past friendship. A Custodian would not. The moment a former ally becomes a threat to the Emperor, that ally ceases to exist as anything other than a target to be eliminated. There is no hesitation, no regret, no moment of doubt. There is only the mission, only the duty, only the absolute imperative to serve the Emperor's will. This was critical. The Emperor had seen what happened when genetically enhanced warriors formed bonds of brotherhood that superseded their loyalty to their creator. He had seen the Thunder Warriors begin to question, to doubt, to wonder why they should continue to serve a being who had cursed them with short lifespans and unstable physiology. The Custodians would have no such doubts. They would be weapons, yes, but weapons that thought for themselves, that could adapt to any threat, that would never rust or dull with age. And it was from these golden warriors, these pinnacles of human genetic engineering, that the Emperor needed to select a leader. Not just any leader, but the leader. The one who would stand at his right hand, the one who would embody everything the Custodian Guard was meant to represent. The one who would be trusted with the Emperor's life, with his secrets, with the very future of humanity. He chose Constantin Valdor. What set Valdor apart from his fellow Custodians? This is where the mystery deepens, where the few surviving records become frustratingly vague. We know that Valdor's origins were hidden even from himself. We know the Emperor went to extraordinary lengths to acquire him as a child. We know that from the moment Valdor's transformation was complete, he was different from every other Custodian who would ever be created. The process of creating a Custodian was, and remains, one of the most closely guarded secrets in the Imperium. Even the High Lords of Terra do not have the right to demand knowledge of how new Custodians are made. What we know comes from fragments, from hints dropped in ancient texts, from the rare moments when the veil is lifted ever so slightly. The transformation begins in infancy. Candidates are selected from the noble houses of Terra. children whose genetic heritage has been scrutinized across generations. These are not random selections. Every family that has provided a child to the Custodian Guard has been chosen for specific genetic markers, for bloodlines that trace back to the earliest days of human genetic excellence. It is considered the greatest honour a Terran noble house can receive, and many families have provided sons to the 10,000 across multiple generations. Once selected, the child is taken into the depths of the Imperial Palace, into laboratories sealed away from the rest of humanity. There, the bioalchemists begin their work. This is not surgery in any conventional sense. It is not the implantation of organs or the grafting of muscle tissue. It is genetic manipulation on a level that approaches the molecular bioalchemy that rewrites the fundamental code of what the child will become. The process takes root in the child's cells, in their very soul, according to some accounts. As the child grows, they transform. Their bodies develop in ways that seem natural, as if they were always meant to be something more than human. There are no crude scars, no signs of artificial enhancement. A custodian's body flows with natural perfection, every muscle and tendon precisely where it should be, functioning in harmony that seems almost orchestral. But the transformation is not merely physical. The psychological conditioning is just as profound. The child's memories of their life before are erased or suppressed. Their personality is reshaped, refined, focused into a single burning purpose: to serve the Emperor. Some texts refer to this as mental castration, a stripping away of emotional connections that might interfere with duty. Custodians do not form the bonds of brotherhood that Space Marines do. They do not know the comfort of companionship in the same way. Each Custodian is an island unto themselves, alone even when surrounded by their fellow Golden Warriors. This makes them stable in ways that other genetically enhanced warriors can never be. A Space Marine might hesitate before firing upon a battle brother who has turned traitor. A Custodian would not. A Thunder Warrior might form bonds with their comrades that could lead to collective rebellion. A Custodian would not. Each Golden Sentinel serves the Emperor and the Emperor alone, their loyalty so absolute that it borders on the mechanical. Yet, for all this conditioning, Custodians are not mindless automatons. They are thinking beings, capable of strategic planning, of adapting to changing circumstances, of making split-second tactical decisions. They are scholars as well as warriors, trained in philosophy, in strategy, in the arts of statecraft. A Custodian is as comfortable discussing political theory as they are cleaving through enemy lines with their guardian spear. This combination of absolute loyalty, individual excellence, and intellectual capability made the Custodians unlike any other military force in human history. They were not an army meant to conquer worlds. They were bodyguards, assassins, investigators, warriors who operated in small groups or even alone, each one a force unto themselves. While the Space Marine legions would number in the tens of thousands, each organised into companies and squads that fought as units, the Custodian Guard numbered precisely 10,000, and each fought as an individual. Constantin Valdor embodied all these qualities to their absolute zenith. From the moment his transformation was complete, it was clear that something about him was different. He stood as tall as the smallest of the Primarchs, eye to eye with Alfarius, the master of the Alpha Legion. His physical capabilities were extraordinary even by Custodian standards. During the Battle of Prospero, Valdor faced 30 of the Thousand Sons' elite Kennetai Blademasters, warriors who could predict their enemies' movements through psychic precognition. Valdor slew every single one, receiving only a single wound in the process. His fighting style was described as economical, precise, without wasted motion. While other warriors might seek glory in combat, might revel in the art of battle, Valdor fought like a craftsman performing a necessary task. There was no joy in it, no pride, no anger, just duty, executed with mechanical perfection. Watching Valdor fight was like watching a master clockmaker assemble a timepiece, each movement flowing into the next with inevitable precision. But Valdor's physical prowess was only part of what made him exceptional. His mind was equally formidable. He served not merely as a warrior but as an advisor to the Emperor, one of the very few beings the Master of Mankind trusted to counsel him on matters of state. By the end of the Unification Wars, Valdor had emerged as part of a ruling triumvirate alongside the Emperor and Malcador the Sigillite, the only other individual the Emperor seemed to regard as something approaching a friend. This is worth dwelling on. The Emperor of Mankind was, by all accounts, a being of such vast intellect and power that he was essentially alone in the universe. His consciousness spanned millennia. He had watched civilizations rise and fall, had seen the worst and best of humanity across thousands of years. There were very few beings who could relate to him, who could understand the weight of the burdens he carried, who could offer counsel that he would actually consider. Malcador was one such being, a fellow perpetual whose age and wisdom approached the Emperor's own, and Constantin Valdor was another. Not because Valdor was the Emperor's equal in power or intelligence, but because Valdor understood the Emperor's purpose with absolute clarity. Valdor had no ambitions of his own, no desires beyond serving the Emperor's will. This made him uniquely valuable as an advisor, because the Emperor could trust that any counsel Valdor offered would be given purely for the sake of the mission, without hidden agendas or personal ambition. This absolute lack of personal ambition set Valdor apart from almost every other figure in the early Imperium. The Primarchs, for all their loyalty, had their own desires, their own visions of what they wanted to achieve. The Space Marine legions were commanded by warriors who sought glory and honour. Even the remembrancers and iterators who spread the Imperial truth had their own interpretations of what that truth meant. But Valdor wanted nothing except to serve. He held a rank higher than the Primarchs in some ways, sat at the centre of Imperial power on Terra, and yet seldom exercised his influence except where it directly concerned the Emperor's safety. This brings us to a critical question. Was this absolute loyalty something Valdor possessed naturally, or was it conditioned into him during his transformation? The answer, almost certainly, is both. The Emperor would have selected Valdor as a child because he saw in that infant's genetic code the potential for absolute loyalty. And then, through the process of transformation, that natural inclination would have been refined, enhanced, made unbreakable. We see hints of Valdor's character in the moments when he's forced to make difficult decisions. During the palace coup, when Thunder Warriors led by their general Ushatan attempted to rebel against the Emperor, Valdor deployed the Proto-Legiones Astartes in their first battle to crush the rebellion. He personally slew Ushatan, a warrior he had admired. The records indicate Valdor took no gratification in the act. It was simply necessary, and so it was done. But then Valdor did something unexpected. He spared Uwoma Kandawire, the Grand Provost Marshal who had been part of the conspiracy, and allowed her to leave the palace to retire in peace. This was not mere mercy, it was calculation. Kandawire's threat was neutralized, and executing her would serve no purpose beyond vengeance. Valdor did not do vengeance. He did what was necessary for the Emperor's goals, nothing more and nothing less. This ability to separate emotion from duty, to see clearly what needed to be done without being clouded by anger or pride or grief, was perhaps Valdor's greatest asset. He could witness the Thunder Warriors, warriors he had fought alongside, being systematically culled by the Emperor's order. He could watch the Emperor make decisions that resulted in millions of deaths. He could see the darkness at the heart of the Imperium's founding, the brutal pragmatism that sacrificed countless lives for the greater good, and he never faltered. Because Valdor understood what the Emperor understood, that the stakes were too high for sentiment, that the survival of humanity required decisions that would haunt any being with a conventional conscience. Yet for all his calculated precision, Valdor was not emotionless. Records from those who knew him describe moments of something approaching personality. When Malcador informed Valdor that the Primarchs were still alive and that the Emperor was searching for them, Valdor expressed surprise. He couldn't understand why the Chaos Gods would have left the Primarchs alive rather than killing them or corrupting them immediately. Valdor believed that if the Primarchs were alive they would be tainted beyond redemption, and it would be better to raise armies of mortals led by Custodians. This reveals something crucial about Valdor's worldview. He did not see the Primarchs as the Emperor's sons, as beings worthy of special consideration. He saw them as tools, powerful but ultimately replaceable. This was the fundamental difference between Valdor and the Emperor. The Emperor, for all his cold pragmatism, had created the Primarchs with something approaching paternal attachment. He referred to them as his sons, showed what might have been affection for some of them, particularly Horus and Sanguinius. Valdor had no such attachments. To him, the Primarchs were genetic constructs designed for a specific purpose. If they failed that purpose, if they were corrupted or compromised, they should be discarded and replaced. This absolutely practical view made Valdor the perfect Captain General, but it also meant he could never truly understand some of the Emperor's decisions. He could not comprehend why the Emperor would risk so much to find and reclaim his lost sons, why he would show them favour, why he would trust them with so much power. But Valdor never questioned these decisions, even when he disagreed with them. This is the paradox at the heart of Constantin Valdor. He was encouraged to think independently, to offer counsel, to question strategies and tactics. Yet his loyalty was so absolute that when the Emperor made a final decision, Valdor would execute it without hesitation, even if he believed it was wrong. He was a thinking weapon, capable of independent judgment, but ultimately subject to a will greater than his own. During the Unification Wars, Valdor proved his worth time and time again. He was present at the Battle of Morland Sen, one of the early campaigns where the Emperor's forces clashed with the techno-barbarian kingdoms. There, Valdor witnessed the savagery of the Thunder Warriors firsthand, saw the way they revelled in bloodshed and destruction. He understood even then that these warriors would have to be replaced, that they were too volatile for the Emperor's long-term plans. A handful of years later, Valdor carried out his first major independent mission. He assassinated Koja Zu, the minister of the Anwatan Steppes, and claimed her son, Ra-Endymion, for the Legio Custodes. This mission demonstrated Valdor's capabilities beyond simple combat. He operated alone, infiltrated enemy territory, eliminated a high-value target, and extracted a child who would go on to become one of the most notable custodians in history. It was the kind of precision operation that would become Valdor's hallmark. As the Unification Wars progressed, Valdor's role expanded. He was not merely the Captain General of the Custodian Guard, he was the Emperor's executioner, his investigator, his most trusted operative. When the Emperor needed someone eliminated quietly, he sent Valdor. When he needed to know if a potential ally could be trusted, he sent Valdor. When he needed counsel on matters of military strategy or political maneuvering, he turned to Valdor. By the time Terra was unified, Valdor had accumulated 1,032 names. In Custodian tradition, names were earned through notable deeds, through victories and accomplishments that added to one's honour. By the 41st millennium, a book containing Valdor's full name took up an entire volume. Think about that for a moment. Over 10,000 years, Valdor's legend grew to the point where simply listing his titles and accomplishments required hundreds of pages. But during the Unification Wars, even with nearly 2,000 names to his credit, Valdor remained humble. He never swaggered or boasted. He took no pleasure in the acclaim of others. When witnesses called him a Primarch in all but name, Valdor did not acknowledge the comparison. He knew he was not a Primarch. He was something different, something made for a more focused purpose. Where the Primarchs were created to lead armies in galactic conquest, to inspire loyalty and command millions, Valdor was made to stand at the Emperor's side and ensure he lived another day. This distinction is crucial to understanding why the Emperor chose Valdor for his role. The Primarchs, when the Emperor finally reclaimed them, would each command a legion of space marines. They would be warlords, conquerors, leaders who needed to inspire devotion in their troops and make strategic decisions that affected entire sectors of space. They needed charisma, vision, the ability to see the grand scope of the Great Crusade. Valdor needed none of these things. He needed to be the ultimate bodyguard, the perfect assassin, the most reliable instrument in the Emperor's arsenal. Where a Primarch might argue with the Emperor, might question his decisions or push for their own interpretation of his will, Valdor simply executed orders with perfect precision. Where a Primarch might harbour ambitions or resentments or pride, Valdor had only duty. This is why, when the Emperor created the Primarchs and scattered them across the galaxy through the machinations of chaos, he did not create more. The Primarchs were a calculated risk, beings of immense power and equally immense personality, each one a potential asset but also a potential liability. The Emperor knew this. He had always known this. And so, he kept the Custodian Guard led by Constantin Valdor as his insurance policy. If the Primarchs failed, if they fell to chaos or turned against him, the Custodians would endure. Valdor would endure, and unlike the Primarchs, Valdor would never fall. He couldn't. His loyalty was not a choice he made, it was woven into the fundamental structure of his being, as inevitable as gravity, as certain as death. The Emperor recognized this quality in Valdor and rewarded it not with praise or honours, but with trust. He gave Valdor a weapon, a guardian spear called the Apollonian spear, believed to have been crafted by the Emperor's own hand. This was not merely a powerful weapon, though it certainly was that. It was a tool for understanding. When Valdor killed with the Apollonian spear, he gained insight into the nature of what he had slain, understanding their true essence in ways few beings could comprehend. Over the years, Valdor used this spear to kill thousands of enemies. Techno-barbarians, Xenos horrors, rogue psychers, demons that slipped through the cracks of reality. Each death added to his understanding, each kill revealed another fragment of truth about the universe and the threats it contained. By the time the Great Crusade began, Valdor had accumulated knowledge that would have driven a lesser being mad. He had stared into the abyss so many times that he understood it in ways even the Emperor might not have fully anticipated. This knowledge did not corrupt Valdor, because corruption implies deviation from purpose, and Valdor's purpose was unshakable. He learned the true names of demons and did not seek to bargain with them. He understood the whispers of chaos and remained deaf to their promises. He saw the worst of humanity and the universe and continued to serve without hesitation. This, perhaps more than anything else, demonstrated why the Emperor had chosen him. Valdor was incorruptible, not because he was ignorant of temptation, but because no temptation could ever compare to the satisfaction of fulfilling his duty. When the Emperor finally began to reclaim his scattered Primarchs, Valdor's role shifted slightly. He was no longer simply the Emperor's bodyguard and advisor. He became the Emperor's representative in dealings with these demigods, a role that placed him in direct contact with beings who were, in many ways, his superiors in power and authority. The Primarchs were extraordinary beings, each one a masterwork of genetic engineering that took everything the Emperor had learned from creating the Custodians and amplified it to mythological proportions. They were bigger, stronger, faster than any Custodian. They had powers that bordered on the supernatural. They could inspire armies with their mere presence, could process information faster than supercomputers, could predict the flow of battle with preternatural accuracy, and yet Constantin Valdor could stand before them without flinching. He could match even a Primarch in single combat, at least according to those who had witnessed him fight. His fighting skills, martial power, and physical and mental abilities put him on par with the Emperor's gene-sons. But more importantly, he held authority that superseded theirs in certain circumstances. When it came to the Emperor's safety, Valdor's word was law, and even Primarchs were expected to obey. This created interesting dynamics. Some Primarchs respected Valdor for his capabilities and absolute loyalty. Others saw him as an obstacle, a reminder that they were not the Emperor's most trusted servants despite their power. The relationship between Valdor and Horus Lupercal, the first Primarch to be rediscovered, and the one who would eventually become Warmaster, was particularly notable. When Horus later turned traitor and declared rebellion against the Emperor, Valdor was among the first to learn of it. When a fellow Custodian, Amuntoramachian, asked how this betrayal could have happened, Valdor rejected theories about pride or resentment. Instead, speaking as someone who knew the Warmaster personally, Valdor voiced his belief that something had driven Horus and his closest advisors mad. This was perceptive. Valdor understood that Horus's fall was not a simple matter of ambition or wounded pride. Something fundamental had broken in the Warmaster, some corruption so deep that it had rewritten his very being. Valdor's response to Horus's betrayal was characteristic of his nature. He immediately proposed that an assassination team be sent to kill Horus before the rebellion could gain momentum. This was not a decision made in anger or a desire for vengeance. It was pure tactical calculation. Horus was the linchpin of the rebellion. Remove him, and the entire structure would collapse. It was the most efficient solution to the problem. Malcador the Sigillite agreed with this assessment and organised the first execution team, drawing the best operative from each temple of the Officio Assassinorum. Valdor oversaw the mission personally, but it failed. Horus had been tipped off, had sent a proxy to die in his place, and the opportunity was lost. The heresy would proceed, and billions would die in the fires of civil war. Some might have despaired at this failure. Valdor simply moved on to the next task. The execution team had provided valuable intelligence about the traitor's capabilities. That intelligence would be used to counter future threats. Every setback was a learning opportunity. Every failure provided data that could be applied to prevent future failures. This absolute pragmatism, this inability to wallow in regret or recrimination, made Valdor an invaluable asset during the darkest days of the heresy. As the heresy escalated, Valdor found himself working closely with Rogel Dawn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, who had been tasked with fortifying Terra against the inevitable assault. The relationship between Valdor and Dawn was respectful but occasionally tense. Dawn believed that preserving the Imperium required maintaining a moral code, that the Imperium could not defeat chaos by becoming as monstrous as the traitors. Valdor argued that defeating Horus required using every tool available, even underhanded tactics that might seem dishonourable. The Emperor settled this debate with a simple proclamation: no more shadows, no more veils. It was a command to fight openly, to wage war honestly rather than through deception and assassination. Some interpreted this as the Emperor agreeing with Dawn's position, but it's equally possible that the Emperor was simply acknowledging a tactical reality. The time for shadows had passed. The war was in the open now, and it would be decided through open battle, not through assassination attempts and covert operations. Valdor accepted this decision without protest, as he accepted all the Emperor's decisions. Even when he disagreed, even when he believed there was a better way, he understood that the Emperor's perspective was broader than his own. The Master of Mankind could see currents in the warp, could perceive futures that might be, and paths that must be avoided. Valdor could not. So he trusted the Emperor's judgment and executed his commands. This absolute trust was tested during the war, within the Webway, when the Emperor's grand project to create a human-controlled network through the warp was sabotaged by Magnus the Red's well-intentioned but catastrophic psychic warning about Horus's betrayal. The Webway breached, and demons poured through, threatening to overrun Terra itself. The Emperor was forced to sit upon the Golden Throne, using his psychic might to hold back the demonic tide while his forces fought a desperate holding action in the Webway tunnels. The Custodian Guard bore the brunt of this nightmare campaign. For years they fought in the Webway, battling demons in conditions that would have broken any other military force. They fought without relief, without respite, watching as their numbers dwindled. The 10,000 became 9,000, then 8,000, then fewer still. And through it all, Constantin Valdor led them, never wavering, never showing doubt or despair. Valdor's leadership during the Webway War demonstrated another reason why the Emperor had chosen him. He could command the Custodian Guard effectively despite their individualistic nature. The Custodians were not a traditional military force. They did not fight in organised squads or follow rigid tactical doctrines. Each Custodian was expected to assess the battlefield independently and act according to their own judgment. This made them incredibly adaptable, but also difficult to coordinate. Valdor could coordinate them. He understood how to deploy individual warriors for maximum effect, how to use their unique capabilities in concert without trying to force them into rigid formations. He led by example, always at the forefront of the most desperate battles, and the other, Custodians followed him not because they felt brotherhood or camaraderie, but because they recognized his excellence and trusted his judgment. This trust was earned through countless battles, where Valdor demonstrated his capabilities. During the fall of Prospero, when Valdor accompanied Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to bring Magnus the Red to account for breaking the Emperor's decree against sorcery, Valdor's forces were responsible for killing at least 3 of the Thousand Sons' greatest psykers and routing a force much more numerous than their own. It was during this campaign that Valdor faced the 30 Kenate Blade Masters and emerged victorious with only a single wound. Stories of Valdor's prowess spread throughout the Imperium. Space Marines who witnessed the Captain General in combat during the Siege of Terra saw him carve through traitor Astartes as easily as those Astartes would fight against ordinary humans. He moved through their ranks like a golden reaper, his guardian spear dealing death with every thrust, his armour turning aside blows that would have crippled lesser warriors. But for all his combat prowess, Valdor's most important role during the heresy was as a member of the Loyalist War Council. Alongside Malcador the Sigillite, Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, Jagatai Khan, and various military commanders, Valdor helped plan the defence of Terra against Horus's approaching armada. He offered tactical advice, coordinated Custodian deployments, and ensured the Emperor's safety as the master of mankind sat upon the Golden Throne, locked in psychic battle with the forces of chaos. Valdor's counsel during these dark days was invaluable, precisely because he had no ego investment in any particular strategy. Where Primarchs might advocate for plans that would showcase their legion's strengths, or avoid strategies that might result in heavy losses for their sons, Valdor simply proposed whatever tactics would most effectively defend Terra. If that meant sacrificing Custodian lives, so be it. If it meant allowing certain districts of the Imperial Palace to fall, so that forces could be concentrated elsewhere, so be it. Valdor made decisions based purely on tactical efficiency, unburdened by sentiment or pride. This cold pragmatism sometimes put him at odds with other members of the War Council, particularly those who still held idealistic notions about honour and the rules of war. But Valdor's position was consistent. The Emperor must be protected at all costs, and anything that served that goal was justified. Everything else was secondary. When Horus finally breached Terra's defences and the siege reached its climax, Valdor was present for one of the most significant moments in Imperial history, the Emperor's final confrontation with the War Master. As Horus's forces broke through to the Imperial Palace itself, and it became clear that the traitors might actually succeed in reaching the throne room, the Emperor made a desperate decision. He would teleport directly to Horus's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit, and end the war by killing the War Master personally. It was an incredibly risky gambit. Horus had become a being of immense power, blessed by all 4 Chaos gods. The Vengeful Spirit was a fortress filled with traitor space marines and demonic entities. The odds of survival were minimal, But the Emperor's prescient sight must have shown him that this was the only path that might lead to victory, and so he took a small force with him, the Primarch Sanguinius, a handful of Space Marines, and Constantin Valdor with his Custodian Guard. The teleportation was sabotaged by Horus's sorceries, scattering the attackers across the vengeful spirit. Valdor and his Custodians found themselves in a dark abyss, surrounded by demons, separated from the Emperor. For perhaps the first time in his existence, Valdor felt something approaching fear. Not fear for himself, but fear that he would fail in his primary duty, that he would not be able to reach the Emperor in time, that the master of mankind would face Horus without his shields at his side. But Valdor did not freeze, he did not despair, he simply began killing. He and his Custodians carved their way through hordes of demons, through traitor Space Marines and Word-bearers, fighting with a desperation that bordered on frenzy. Valdor used the Apollonian spear to pierce the floor of the ship itself, confirming that they were indeed aboard the vengeful spirit and orienting himself toward where the Emperor must be. They fought through madness and horror, through realms where the laws of physics bent and broke, through nightmares given form, and slowly, agonizingly, they made progress toward the Emperor's location. But they were too late. By the time Valdor could have reached the throne room where the Emperor faced Horus, the duel was already over. Horus was dead, slain by the Emperor's power after the War Master had mortally wounded the Master of Mankind. Rogel Dawn and the remains of Valdor's Custodian force retrieved the Emperor's broken body. His spine was shattered, his body more dead than alive, sustained only by his vast psychic might. They brought him back to Terra, to the Golden Throne, where he would be interred in the life support systems that had been meant to power his Webway project. But the Golden Throne required someone to operate it, to channel the psychic energies needed to keep the Emperor alive and hold back the demonic tide still pouring through the breached Webway. Malcador the Sigillite took that burden upon himself, sitting upon the throne even though it would kill him. For a time, Malcador held the throne, his body withering under the immense strain, until the Emperor could be brought to replace him. Valdor was there for all of this. He witnessed the death of Malcador, the only being besides the Emperor whom he might have considered a friend. He watched as the Emperor was interred in the Golden Throne, his vast, consciousness bound to the psychic beacon that would guide humanity through the warp. He heard the Emperor's final words to Rogel Dawn, instructions for how the Imperium should proceed now that its founder could no longer actively lead it. And then Constantin Valdor faced a reality that he had never imagined, a future where the Emperor could not speak to him, could not give him orders, could not offer counsel. For 10,000 years Valdor had served at the Emperor's side, had taken guidance from the Master of Mankind's wisdom. Now that guidance was gone. The Emperor lived, in a sense, but he could not communicate, could not give orders, could not tell Valdor what to do next. For any other being, this might have led to a crisis of identity. Valdor's entire existence had been defined by service to the Emperor. With that service seemingly at an end, what purpose did he have? But Valdor did not break. He could not break. His purpose remained unchanged: protect the Emperor and serve his will. The fact that the Emperor could no longer speak did not absolve Valdor of that duty. It simply meant that Valdor would have to interpret what the Emperor would have wanted and act accordingly. In the immediate aftermath of the heresy, Valdor continued to serve. He became one of the first High Lords of Terra, helping to establish the administrative structures that would govern the Imperium in the Emperor's absence. He oversaw the reorganization of the Custodian Guard, ensuring that new recruits could be trained and created, even without the Emperor's direct involvement. He helped Rogel Dawn and Guilliman lay the foundations for the Imperium as it would exist for the next 10 millennia. But something had changed in Constantin Valdor. Those who knew him before and after the Emperor's interment on the Golden Throne noted a difference, a distance that had not been there before. Valdor had always been stoic, emotionless in his execution of duty. But now there was something else, something harder to define. A sense of purpose that transcended the visible Imperium, a focus on goals that only Valdor understood. And then, one night, Constantin Valdor simply left. He slipped out of the Imperial Palace in the dead of night, turned back once to look upon the golden spires, and whispered 2 words, "Only in death." It was the beginning of the Imperial saying, "Only in death does duty end." And then he was gone, vanishing into the darkness, his fate unknown even to his fellow custodians. The disappearance of Constantin Valdor is one of the great mysteries of Warhammer 40,000 lore. For 10,000 years his fate was unknown, speculated upon but never confirmed. Some believed he had died in some final mission. Others thought he had simply retired, gone into isolation to contemplate the failures that had led to the Emperor's internment on the Golden Throne. Still others whispered that he had turned traitor, though such suggestions were met with absolute denial from the Custodian Guard. Recent revelations, particularly in the Bequin novels, suggest something far more complex. At the end of the novel Penitent, the mysterious figure known as the King in Yellow, head of a vast secret network that might predate the Imperium itself, is identified as Constantin Valdor. The King in Yellow commands a city built in the warp itself, the City of Dust, where he leads an army of winged Astartes that might be clones of Sanguinius, hundreds of cloned blanks each hosting a demon they can command, and a golden war fleet of incredible power. The King in Yellow's goal, according to various sources, involves the language of Enuncia and possibly discovering the Emperor's true name. This has led to speculation that Valdor is either trying to save the Emperor through some grand plan that requires 10,000 years to accomplish, or that he has turned to darker methods in service of goals he believes the Emperor would have wanted. The evidence suggests the former. Every faction that opposes the King in Yellow, from the Inquisition to the traitor legions, from the Elder Craft worlds to various chaos cults, believes he is a threat. But in Warhammer 40,000, when everyone agrees something is bad, there's a good chance it's actually necessary. The Inquisition has been wrong before. The traitor legions oppose anything that might help the Imperium, and the Eldar, for all their claims of foresight, have their own agenda that doesn't necessarily align with humanity's best interests. If Valdor is indeed the King in Yellow, and if he's been working for 10,000 years on some grand project, it would be entirely in character for him. Valdor's loyalty to the Emperor was absolute. His understanding of the Emperor's goals was as complete as any being who was not the Emperor himself. If Valdor believed there was a way to save the Emperor, to restore him somehow, or to complete some project the Emperor had begun, then Valdor would pursue that goal with the same absolute dedication he had shown throughout his existence. This would explain his methods. If Valdor is using cloned blanks hosting demons, if he's delving into Enuncia and building fortresses in the warp itself, it's not because he's been corrupted. It's because these are the tools necessary for whatever he's trying to accomplish. Valdor was never constrained by conventional morality. He was constrained by the need to serve the Emperor's will. If dark means are required to achieve bright ends, Valdor would use those means without hesitation. The Apollonian spear may be key to understanding Valdor's transformation. The spear allowed him to understand the true nature of everything he killed with it. Over the years, Valdor killed thousands of demons, traitors, Xenos horrors and other enemies. Each death would have given him insight into their nature, their essence, their connection to the warp and chaos. Piece by piece, kill by kill, Valdor would have assembled an understanding of the fundamental forces that shape the universe that perhaps no other being except the Emperor possessed. This knowledge might have shown him truths about the Emperor's condition, about the nature of the Golden Throne, about the possibilities for salvation or restoration that no one else could see. It might have revealed to him the language of Enuncia, or at least pointed him toward where that knowledge could be found. It might have shown him that the only way to save the Emperor required building an army amassing resources and working in secret for 10,000 years. This is speculation, of course. The full truth of the king in Yellow's identity and goals has not been fully revealed in the lore. But if it is Valdor, if he has been working all this time to fulfill some final command from the Emperor, or to complete some mission he believes the Emperor would have wanted, then it would be the ultimate expression of why the Emperor chose him in the first place. Constantin Valdor was chosen because he would never stop, because his loyalty was so absolute that not even 10,000 years of silence from his master could shake it. Because he had the capability, the intelligence, and the will to accomplish tasks that might take millennia to complete. Because when the Emperor needed someone who would pursue his goals long after he could no longer give orders, who would make the hard decisions and use whatever means were necessary, he knew Valdor would be that person. The Emperor chose Valdor because Valdor was the only one who could be trusted with the longest game of all. So we return to our original question. Why did the Emperor choose Constantin Valdor? The answer, as with most things involving the Emperor, is layered and complex. On the surface level, Valdor was chosen because he was the best. He was the most capable warrior, the most brilliant strategist, the most loyal servant. These qualities alone would have been sufficient to make him Captain General of the Custodian Guard. But the deeper truth is that Valdor was chosen because he represented everything the Emperor valued when he embarked on his mission to save humanity. Valdor had no ego, no personal ambition, no desire for glory or recognition. He was a pure instrument, a weapon that could be wielded with absolute precision. He could be trusted with secrets that would break other beings. He could make decisions that would haunt any conscience that was not as focused as his own. He could serve for centuries, for millennia, without wavering or wondering if there might be a better path. The Emperor created many extraordinary beings. The Primarchs were demigods, capable of incredible feats, inspiring millions with their presence. The Space Marines were superhuman warriors who could conquer worlds. The Thunder Warriors were berserkers of unprecedented power. But none of these creations had the one quality the Emperor needed most: absolute reliability. The Primarchs, for all their power, were ultimately flawed. Half of them fell to chaos. Even the loyal half had their moments of doubt, their disagreements with the Emperor, their own interpretations of what the imperial truth meant. The Space Marines were the same, prone to the same weaknesses of pride and ambition that afflicted their Primarchs. And the Thunder Warriors were so unstable they had to be culled. Valdor was different. Valdor was reliable in a way that no Primarch could ever be, because Valdor did not have the capacity for the kind of doubt or ambition that led to betrayal. He was not incorruptible because he was ignorant of temptation, or because he was psychically shielded from chaos. He was incorruptible because corruption requires desire, and Valdor desired nothing except to fulfill his duty. This made him unique in the entire Imperium. The Emperor could trust that Valdor would interpret his will correctly, would make decisions that aligned with his goals, would never use his position for personal gain or to push his own agenda. In an Imperium built on hierarchies and power structures, where every position of authority was a potential point of corruption or compromise, Valdor was the one constant the Emperor could rely upon. This is why Valdor was given the Apollonian spear, why he was trusted with missions that no one else could be trusted with, why he sat at the centre of imperial power alongside the Emperor and Malcador. Not because he was the strongest warrior, though he was among the strongest. Not because he was the most intelligent tactician, though his tactical acumen was formidable, but because he was the one person the Emperor could trust completely, without reservation, without doubt. When the Emperor looked at Constantin Valdor, he did not see a person. He saw the perfect fulfillment of his vision for what a servant could be. He saw loyalty distilled to its purest form, competence refined to its highest expression, dedication that bordered on the divine. He saw a being who would never ask why when given an order, but who would always understand the why nonetheless, and execute the order with a precision that took that understanding into account. This is what the Emperor needed from his Captain General. Not a friend, though Valdor was perhaps as close to a friend as the Emperor could have. Not a son, though Valdor was in some ways more loyal than any of the Emperor's actual sons. Not a companion, though he stood at the Emperor's side for longer than any other being. What the Emperor needed was a weapon that could think for itself, that could be trusted with the sharpest edges of his plans, that would never rust or dull or break no matter how long it was used or how terrible the tasks it was given. Constantin Valdor was that weapon. And that is why, of all the custodians the Emperor could have chosen, of all the warriors and generals and advisors at his disposal, he selected this particular golden sentinel to be the first of the 10,000, the just shield of the Emperor, the Captain General who would guard him when all others failed. The Emperor's choice was vindicated 10,000 years ago when Valdor fought through the vengeful spirit, trying to reach his master's side, and it may be vindicated again in the present day if the theories about the King in Yellow are true. For Constantin Valdor, if he still lives, is still serving the Emperor's will, still pursuing goals that the Master of Mankind set in motion before his internment on the Golden Throne, still executing a mission that may take 10,000 years or more to complete. The Emperor chose Valdor because Valdor would never stop serving. Because duty to Valdor was not a choice or a burden. It was simply what he was, the defining characteristic of his existence, as fundamental as breathing is to a normal human. The Emperor needed someone who would serve him even after he could no longer give orders, who would interpret his will and act upon it even in his silence, who would pursue his goals across millennia if necessary. And in Constantin Valdor, the Emperor found exactly that. A servant whose service would outlast empires, whose loyalty would survive the death of gods, whose purpose would endure when all else failed. That is why the Emperor chose Valdor. That is the answer to the question that has haunted imperial scholars for 10,000 years. Not because Valdor was the best warrior, though he was. Not because he was the most intelligent, though his mind was formidable. Not because he was the most powerful, though he could stand alongside Primarchs and not be diminished. The Emperor chose Constantin Valdor because Valdor was and remains the perfect instrument for the longest war humanity would ever fight. A war that began in the Age of Strife, continued through the Unification Wars and the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, and still rages on in the dying days of the 41st millennium. A war that will only end when humanity either achieves the Emperor's vision of a unified, enlightened civilization freed from the predations of chaos, or when the last human takes their final breath and the species is extinguished forever. Constantin Valdor was chosen to fight that war, to serve as the Emperor's instrument in that ultimate conflict, to be the golden sentinel who would never falter, never fail, never stop. And that ultimately is the answer. The Emperor chose Valdor not for what he could do in a single battle or a single campaign, but for what he could accomplish across 10,000 years or more. He chose Valdor because Valdor was the only one who could be trusted with the infinite game, the only one whose dedication was so absolute that no amount of time could erode it, no amount of suffering could break it, no amount of temptation could seduce it. The Emperor chose Constantin Valdor because Valdor was eternal, in a way that even the Emperor himself, for all his power, could not be. The Emperor's body could be broken, his voice silenced, his direct influence ended. But Valdor's service would continue, unchanged and unchanging, a constant in a galaxy of chaos, a fixed point around which the future of humanity would pivot. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into why the Emperor chose Constantin Valdor, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more Warhammer 40k lore. There's so much more to explore in this universe, and we're just getting started. What do you think about Valdor? Do you believe he's the King in Yellow? Do you think his mission, whatever it is, will succeed? Let me know in the comments below. The Emperor protects, and so does Constantin Valdor, whether we know it or not.